Reading from Psalm 34, verse 8. "O taste and see that the Lord is good. Happy are those who take refuge in him." Before we moved to this area, we lived in an old house that had been built back in the 1820s. And I realize that's nothing compared to you, Debbie, who lived in the house that General Lafayette had once occupied back there during the Valley Forge encounter. But still, 1820 was an old house in a number of ways, and the construction of the house reflected the times in which it had been built and the times that it had lived through. In the kitchen, there was a large stone fireplace, which was obviously from a time when it was used to heat the house as well as to cook over. Out in the yard, there was a hand-dug well for water, all lined with stones dug out of the field. Down in the basement, up in the beams, you could see the ceramic tubes and knobs that were put in when electricity was first introduced and installed into the house. In some ways, it was kind of like an architectural time capsule, preserving relics from previous generations and centuries. Well, these curiosities were interesting, but they were just an unimportant background to the more important work of raising children and being in a loving family relationship. What is important to me about that house was not these historical artifacts, but the memories of the special times that we spent there as a family, the love that made a house a home. And when we moved to this area, we were not looking for a house containing obsolete historic artifacts. Rather, of course, we were looking for a place where the family story and our relationship with our children and their spouses and our grandchildren could continue. I mention this because the other day I came across a disturbing statistic. In a new Gallup poll, it was reported that belief in God is at an all-time low in the United States. For young adults in particular, belief in God has dropped by 10 points in the last 5 years. And a primary reason given for this loss of faith among young people is the church's rejection of science. They are leaving the faith because they feel they must choose between the truth of science and the truth of the Bible. Now, I doubt you've ever heard that in this church, but it is certainly out there. I mean, to me, this is like saying that a house is really not a home unless there are knob and tube ceramics in the basement for the electrical wire. The passage I read this morning, taste and see that the Lord is good, I chose because I believe that a thoughtful consideration of the Bible is more honoring to God than a blind faith where we're simply not going to look at any of the problems. Another verse that could have been used would have been from 2 Timothy 2:15. Study, work at it, strain and exert effort to show yourself approved by God, correctly handling and explaining God's word of truth. Through the scriptures, God has given us a wonderful treasure that will help us to develop our faith, a faith that we can have for ourselves. We read about the forgiveness of sins and our forgiveness of others. There is the example, the teaching of Jesus. There is the call to a life that serves its highest purpose. There is the clarity and the encouragement that comes with prayer. There is the peace that passes all understanding. There is the joy of the Lord. There is the opportunity to serve others. There is the opportunity to be the salt of the earth. However, just like an old house, there are portions of the Bible that contain historic artifacts. There are ancient artifacts contained within the literature of the Bible that you would certainly expect to find from a work that is over 4,000 years old. Some of the ideas in the Bible reflect a shepherd's understanding of the world, an understanding that we have grown beyond. God's revelation is certainly a treasure, but it is carried in literature that gives an ancient world understanding that is simply out of step with modern science and modern understandings. And I'm just going to present 3 examples. In Psalm 19, it's a beautiful passage. The heavens proclaim the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims the handiwork of God. In the heavens he has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom from his wedding canopy, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. Its rising is from the end of the heavens, and its circuit to the end of them. Nothing is hid from its heat. It's a beautiful piece of literature celebrating the sun as radiant as a bridegroom running its course from one end of the heavens to the other. But of course, this passage and others like it reflect the ancient belief that the earth was the center of the solar system, and that the planets and the sun all revolved around the earth. Well, it certainly could look that way. But in the 1500s, there was a devout Christian by the name of Copernicus, who had a real gift for mathematics. And as he began to make observations of the heavens, he developed elegant calculations to describe the movement of the heavenly bodies, and concluded that all of the planets of our solar system were orbiting the sun. Copernicus was a very smart fellow, and knowing how the church leadership would react to such upsetting news, was smart enough to keep his discovery a secret. And he did not allow his papers with their shocking conclusions to be published until he was on his deathbed. Indeed, Christians of all stripe were quick to condemn his writings. Even Martin Luther angrily denounced his work, claiming that Copernicus wishes to reverse the entire science of astronomy. But the sacred scriptures tell us that Joshua commanded the sun to stand still, not the earth. Well, so what do we do with this passage where Joshua was battling the Amorites and God ordered the sun to stand still for an hour? Did God really order the earth to stop rotating for an hour? Well, we know that the Earth is around 24,000 miles around at the equator, and that the Earth is turning about 1,000 miles an hour. And of course, it doesn't feel like that because everything else is turning with the Earth. I mean, all of the trees and the buildings and the air, everything is moving at the same speed as the Earth rotates. But just imagine for a moment, what would happen if you were traveling at 1,000 miles an hour and suddenly everything stopped? Wow. How far do you think you would roll before you came to a stop? But when we think about the Christmas stories, we remember the astrologers who came from the east bearing gifts to see the newborn king of the Jews. Astrology was an incredibly prestigious and significant study in ancient times. The Chaldean astronomers mapped out the constellations and developed theories about the position of the sun and the moon and the planets influence events here upon the earth, and made predictions about what would happen if the moon and the sun were in opposition to each other or were catching up, or all of those kinds of details entered into their understanding, which made it just an incredibly sophisticated and feared and awesome kind of course of study. But in this passage, describing Joshua's battles, it is the God of Israel that controls the movement within the heavens, demonstrating that God is greater than their most advanced astronomy. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that this particular passage about the sun stopping in the heavens was really not about their science. Rather, it was a theological statement about God's greatness and God's power. Some years after Copernicus, the mathematics instructor, Galileo, built a homemade telescope and began looking up into the heavens, and what he saw was so amazing, he didn't get a full night's sleep for months afterwards. He was so consumed with viewing the heavens through his tool. He too verified that the perceived movement of the sun was caused by the once-a-day rotation of the earth, and that the sun, not the earth, was the center of our solar system. He wrote in his journal, "I render infinite thanks to God for being so kind as to make me alone the first observer of marvels kept hidden in obscurity for all previous centuries." But the church was not so generous in its praise, arresting him, charging him with heresy, using its power to force him to recant, and so on and so on. And it certainly wasn't the church's best day. Just one more example. We read in the creation account in Genesis that on the fourth day, God made two great lights, the greater to rule the day, the lesser to rule the night. And God put the stars up in the dome of the sky where they mark the times and the season. And so we have the bright sunlight, we have the dimmer moonlight, and we have all of the twinkling stars spoken of in Genesis. Now, when we get to the book of Revelation, we find that there is a time of great tribulation, and the stars of the sky fall to the earth. And it describes it this way: like the fig tree drops its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. And you can imagine watching a tree that is being buffeted by the wind in a storm and seeing all the little figs dropping down on the ground as a result. in Bible times. The stars were seen and understood as little twinkling lights up there in the night sky. Today, we understand that stars are huge. Our own sun has a diameter more than 100 times the size of the earth. And rather than stars falling like little snowflakes, we know that to get within 1,000,000 miles of the sun would simply vaporize the earth. So just because an ancient biblical writer had a particular understanding of the cosmos does not make it the truth. The purpose of the Bible is not to teach us an ancient pre-scientific worldview. Rather, it is to provide us with God's perspective and to help us make God-honoring choices in our lives. By thinking about, by reinterpreting the Bible, we are actually following the example of Jesus. You remember one Sabbath day he was teaching in the synagogue, and there was a woman who was all bent over and unable to stand up straight, and she'd been that way for 18 years. Jesus went to her, he laid his hands on her, and she was healed. She was able to stand up straight again. Yay for Jesus, yay for God. This woman has been set free from this terrible affliction. But the leader of the synagogue was very upset by this. Jesus had broken one of the 10 commandments. According to the scriptures, there are 6 other days in the week when healing can be done. This work should not be done on the Sabbath. But Jesus explained the Sabbath was given for the benefit of humanity, to provide a day off from the endless work and drudgery of life, a day of rest, to remember that they had been created in the image of God. Jesus invoked the principle that the Sabbath had been given for humanity's benefit, and that healing was in harmony with that benefit, with that principle. You know, I'm sorry to say that sometimes it seems common for religion to be used to condemn people who may differ from us, or to try to control their thoughts. But Jesus said to us, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Amen.